7th of January 1778, nearly 2 years later. 1. Charles had begun by resenting Washington, and the fact that our assassination attempt had failed only increased his anger. He took it as a personal affront that Washington had survived. How dare he? So never quite forgave him for it. Shortly afterwards, New York had fallen to the British, and Washington, who was almost captured, was held to blame, not least by Charles, who was singularly unimpressed by Washington's subsequent foray across the Delaware River, despite the fact that his victory at the Battle of Trenton had renewed confidence in the Revolution. For Charles, it was more grist to the mill that Washington went on to lose the Battle of Brandywine and thus Philadelphia. Washington's attack on the British at Germantown had been a catastrophe, and now there was Valley Forge. After winning the Battle of White Marsh, Washington had taken his troops to what he hoped was a safer location for the new year. Valley Forge in Pennsylvania was the high ground he chose. 12,000 Continentals, so badly equipped and fatigued that the shoeless men left a trail of bloody footprints when they marched to make camp and prepare for the coming winter. They were a shambles. Food and clothing was in woefully short supply, while horses starved to death or died on their feet. Typhoid, jaundice, dysentery and pneumonia ran unchecked throughout the camp and killed thousands. Morale and discipline was so low as to be virtually non-existent. Still, though, despite the loss of New York and Philadelphia, and the long, slow, freezing death of his army at Valley Forge, Washington had his guardian angel, Connor. And Connor, with the certainty of youth, believed in Washington. No words of mine could possibly persuade him otherwise, that much was for certain. Nothing I could have said would convince him that Washington was in fact responsible for the death of his mother. In his mind, it was Templars who were responsible, and who can blame him for coming to that conclusion? After all, he saw Charles there that day, and not just Charles, but William, Thomas, and Benjamin. Ah, Benjamin. My other problem. He had these past years been something of a disgrace to the order, to put it mildly. After attempting to sell information to the British, he had been hauled before a court of inquiry in 75, headed by who else but George Washington. By now, Benjamin was, just as he'd predicted all those years ago, the chief physician and director general of the medical service of the Continental Army. He was convicted of communicating with the enemy, and imprisoned, and, to all intents and purposes, he had remained so until earlier this year, when he had been released, and promptly gone missing. Whether he had recanted the ideals of the order, just as Braddock had done all those years ago, I didn't know. What I did know was that he was likely to be the one behind the theft of supplies bound for Valley Forge, which of course was making matters worse for the poor souls camped there, that he had forsaken the goals of the order in favour of personal gain, and that he needed to be stopped, a task I'd taken upon myself, starting in the vicinity of Valley Forge, and riding through the freezing snow-covered Philadelphia wilds until I came to the church where Benjamin had made camp. 2. A church to find a church, but abandoned, not just by its erstwhile congregation, but by Benjamin's men. Days ago they'd been here, but now, nothing. No supplies, no men, just the remains of fires already cold, and irregular patches of mud and snowless ground where tents had been pitched. I tethered my horse at the back of the church, then stepped inside, where it was just as bone-freezing, numbing cold as it was outside. Along the aisle were the remains of more fires, and by the door was a pile of wood which, on closer inspection, I realized was church pews that had been chopped up. Reverence is the first victim of the cold. The remaining pews were in 2 rows either side of the church, facing an imposing but long disused pulpit, and dust floated and danced in broad shafts of light projected through grimy windows, high up in imposing stone walls. Scattered around a rough stone floor were various upturned crates and the remains of packaging, and for a few moments I paced around, occasionally stooping to overturn a crate in the hope that I might find some clue as to where Benjamin had got to. Then a noise. Footsteps from the door. And I froze before darting behind the pulpit just as the huge oak doors creaked slowly and ominously open, and a figure entered. A figure who could have been tracing my exact steps, for the way he seemed to pace around the church floor just as I had done, upturning and investigating crates, and even cursing under his breath, just as I had. It was Connor. I peered from the shadows behind the pulpit. He wore his assassin's robes and an intense look, and I watched him for a moment. It was as though I were watching myself. A younger version of myself, as an assassin. The path I should have taken. The path I was being groomed to take, and would have done, had it not been for the treachery of Reginald Birch. Watching him, Connor, what I felt was a fierce mixture of emotions, among them regret, bitterness, even envy. I moved closer. Let's see how good an assassin he really is. Or, to put it another way, let's see if I still had it. 3. I did. "Father," he said, when I had him down and the blade to his throat. "Connor," I said sardonically. "Any last words?" "Wait." A poor choice. He struggled and his eyes blazed. "Come to check up on Church, have you? Make sure he's stolen enough for your British brothers?" "Benjamin Church is no brother of mine," I tutted. "No more than the Redcoats or their idiot king. I expected naivety, but this... The Templars do not fight for the crown. We seek the same as you, boy. Freedom, justice, independence." But what?" I asked. "Johnson, Pitcairn, Hickey. They tried to steal land, to sack towns, to murder George Washington." I sighed. "Johnson sought to own the land that we might keep it safe. Pitcairn aimed to encourage diplomacy, which you cocked up thoroughly enough to start a goddamned war. And Hickey? George Washington is a wretched leader. He's lost nearly every battle in which he's taken part. The man's racked by uncertainty and insecurity. Take one look at Valley Forge and you know my words are true. We'd all be better off without him." What I was saying had an effect on him, I could tell. "Look, much as I'd love to spar with you, Benjamin Church's mouth is as big as his ego. You clearly want the supplies he's stolen. I want him punished. Our interests are aligned." "What do you propose?" he said warily. What did I propose? I thought. I saw his eyes go to the amulet at my throat, and mine in turn went to the necklace he wore. No doubt his mother told him about the amulet. No doubt he would want to take it from me. On the other hand, the emblems we wore around our necks were both reminders of her. "A truce," I said. Perhaps some time together will do us good. You are my son, after all, and might still be saved from your ignorance." There was a pause. "Or I can kill you now, if you prefer," I laughed. "Do you know where Church has gone?" he asked. "Afraid not. I'd hoped to ambush him when he or one of his men returned here. But it seems I was too late. They've come and cleared the place out." "I may be able to track him," he said, with an oddly proud note in his voice. I stood back and watched as he gave me an ostentatious demonstration of Achilles' training, pointing to marks on the church floor where the crates had been dragged. The cargo was heavy, he said. It was probably loaded onto a wagon for transport. There were rations inside the crates, medical supplies and clothing as well. Outside the church, Connor gestured to some churned-up snow. There was a wagon here, slowly weighed down as they loaded it with the supplies. Snows obscured the tracks, but enough remains that we can still follow. Come on. I collected my horse, joined him, and together we rode out, Connor indicating the line of the tracks as I tried to keep my admiration from showing. Not for the first time I found myself struck by the similarities in our knowledge, and noted him doing just as I would have done in the same situation. Some 15 miles out of the camp, he twisted in the saddle and shot me a triumphant look, at the same time as he indicated the trail up ahead. There was a broken-down cart, its driver trying to repair the wheel and muttering as we approached. Just my luck. Going to freeze to death if I don't get this fixed. Surprised, he looked up at our arrival, and his eyes widened in fear. Not far away was his musket, but too far to reach. Instantly I knew, just as Connor haughtily demanded, "Are you Benjamin Church's man?" that he was going to make a run for it. And sure enough, he did. Wild-eyed, he scrambled to his feet and took off into the trees, wading into the snow with a pronounced trudging run, as ungainly as a wounded elephant. Well played, I smiled, and Connor flashed me an angry look, then leapt from his saddle and dived into the tree line to chase the cart driver. I let him go, then sighed and climbed down from my horse, checked my blade, and listened to the commotion from the forest as Connor caught the man. Then I strode into the forest to join them. It was not wise to run, Connor was saying. He'd pinned the driver against a tree. What do you want? The wretch managed. Where is Benjamin Church? I don't know. He was riding for a camp just north of here. It's where we normally unload the cargo. Maybe you'll find him His eyes darted to me as if looking for support. So I drew my pistol and shot him. Enough of that, I said. Best be on our way, then. You did not have to kill him, said Connor, wiping the man's blood from his face. We know where the camp is, I told him. He'd served his purpose. As we returned to our horses, I wondered how I appeared to him. What was I trying to teach him? Did I want him as brittle and worn as I was? Was I trying to show him where the path led? Lost in thought, we rode towards the site of the camp, and as soon as we saw the telltale wafting smoke above the tips of the trees, we dismounted, tethered our horses, and continued on foot, passing stealthily and silently through the trees. We stayed in the trees, crawling on our bellies and using my spyglass to squint through trunks and bare branches at distant men who made their way around the camp and clustered around fires trying to keep warm. Connor left to make his way into the camp, while I made myself comfortable, out of sight. Or at least, I thought so. I thought I was out of sight, until I felt the tickle of a musket at my neck, and the words, "Well, well, well, what have we here?" Cursing, I was dragged to my feet. There were 3 of them, all looking pleased with themselves to have caught me. As well they should, because I wasn't easily sneaked up on. 10 years ago I would have heard them and crept noiselessly away. 10 years before that, I would have heard them coming, hidden, then taken them all out. 2 held muskets on me while one of them came forward, licking his lips nervously. Making a noise as if impressed, he unfastened my hidden blade, then took my sword, dagger, and pistol. And only when I was unarmed did he dare relax, grinning to reveal the tiny skyline of blackened and rotting teeth. I did have one hidden weapon, of course. Connor. But where the hell had he got to? Rotting Teeth stepped forward. Thank God he was so bad at hiding his intentions that I was able to twist away from the knee he drove into my groin, just enough to avoid serious hurt, but make him think otherwise. And I yelped in pretend pain and dropped to the frozen ground, where I stayed for the time being, looking more dazed than I felt, and playing for time. "Must be a Yank spy," said one of the other men. He leaned on his musket to bend and look at me. "No, he's something else," said the first one, and he too bent to me, as I pulled myself to my hands and knees. "Something special. Isn't that right? Hi, Tam." "Church told me all about you," said the foreman. "Then you should know better than this," I said. "You ain't really in any position to be making threats," snarled Rotting Teeth. "Not yet," I said, calmly. "Really?" said Rotting Teeth. "How about we prove otherwise? You ever had a musket butt in your teeth?" "No, but it looks like you can tell me how it feels." "You what? You trying to be funny?" My eyes travelled up to the branches of a tree behind them, where I saw Connor crouched, his hidden blade extended, and a finger to his lips. You'd be an expert in the trees, of course, taught no doubt by his mother. She'd tutored me in the finer points of climbing, too. Nobody could move through the trees like her. I looked up at Rotting Teeth, knowing he had mere seconds' life to live. It took the sting out of his boot as it connected with my jaw, and I was lifted and sent flying backwards, landing in a heap in a small thicket. Perhaps now would be a good time, Connor, I thought. Through eyesight glazed with pain, I was rewarded by seeing Connor drop from his perch, his blade hand shoot forward, then its blood-flecked silver steel appear from within the mouth of the first luckless guard. The other two were dead by the time I pulled myself to my feet. "New York," said Connor. "What about it?" "That's where Benjamin is to be found." "Then that's where we need to be." 26th of January, 1778. 1. New York had changed since I last visited, to say the least. It had burned. The Great Fire of September 76 had started in the Fighting Cocks Tavern, destroyed over 500 homes, and left around a quarter of the city burnt out and uninhabitable. The British had put the city under martial law as a result. People's homes had been seized and given to British Army officers. The churches had been converted into prisons, barracks, or infirmaries, and it was as though the very spirit of the city had somehow been dimmed. Now it was the Union flag that hung limply from flagpoles at the summit of orange brick buildings, and where before the city had an energy and bustle about it, life beneath its canopies and porticos and behind its windows, now those same canopies were dirty and tattered, the windows blackened with soot. Life went on, but the townsfolk barely raised their eyes from the street. Now their shoulders were drooped, their movements dispirited. In such a climate, finding Benjamin's whereabouts had not been difficult. He was in an abandoned brewery on the waterfront, it turned out. "We should be done with this by sunrise," I rather rashly predicted. "Good," replied Connor. "I would like to have those supplies returned as soon as possible." "Of course. I wouldn't want to keep you from your lost cause." "Come on then, follow me." To the roofs we went, and moments later we were looking out over the New York skyline, momentarily awed by the sight of it in all its war-torn, tattered glory. "Tell me something," Connor said after some moments. "You could have killed me when we first met. What stayed your hand?" "I could have let you die at the gallows," I thought. I could have had Thomas kill you in Bridewell Prison. What stayed my hand on those 2 occasions also? What was the answer? Was I getting old? Sentimental? Perhaps I was nostalgic for a life I never really had. None of this I especially cared to share with Connor, however, and eventually, after a pause, I dismissed his question with curiosity. Any other questions? What is it the Templars seek? Order, I said. Purpose. Direction. No more than that. It's your lot that means to confound us with all that nonsense talk of freedom. Once upon a time, the assassins professed a more sensible goal, that of peace. Freedom is peace, he insisted. No, it is an invitation to chaos. Only look at this little revolution your friends have started. I have stood before the Continental Congress, listened to them stamp and shout, all in the name of liberty. But it's just a noise. And this is why you favour Charles Lee? He understands the needs of this would-be nation far better than the jobbernows who profess to represent it. It seems to me your tongue has tasted sour grapes, he said. The people made their choice, and it was Washington. There it was again. I almost envied him how he looked at the world in such an unequivocal way. His was a world free of doubt, it seemed. When he eventually learnt the truth about Washington, which, if my plan succeeded, would be soon, his world, and not just his world, but his entire world view, would be shattered. If I envied him his certainty now, I didn't envy him that. The people chose nothing, I sighed. It was done by a group of privileged cowards seeking only to enrich themselves. They convened in private and made a decision that would benefit them. They may have dressed it up with pretty words, but that doesn't make it true. The only difference, Connor, the only difference between myself and those you aid, is that I do not feign affection. He looked at me. Not long ago I had said to myself that my words would never have any effect on him. Yet here I was, trying anyway. And maybe I was wrong. Maybe what I said was getting through. 2. At the brewery, it became apparent that we needed a disguise for Connor, his assassin's robes being a little on the conspicuous side. Procuring one gave him a chance to show off again, and once more I was stingy with my praise. When we were both suitably attired, we made our way towards the compound, the red brick walls towering above us, the dark windows staring implacably upon us. Through the gates I could see the barrels and carts of the brewery business, as well as men walking to and fro. Benjamin had replaced most of the Templar men with mercenaries of his own. It was history repeating itself, I thought, my mind going back to Edward Braddock. I only hoped Benjamin wouldn't be as tough to kill as Braddock. Somehow I doubted it. I had little faith in the calibre of my enemy these days. I had little faith in anything these days. "Hold, strangers!" A guard stepped out of the shadows, disturbing the fog that swirled around our ankles. "You tread on private property. What business have you here?" I tipped the brim of my hat to show him my face. "The Father of Understanding guides us," I said, and the man seemed to relax, though he looked warily at Connor. "You I recognize," he said, "but not the savage." "He's my son," I said, and it was odd, hearing the sentiment upon my own lips. The guard, meanwhile, was studying Connor carefully, then, with a sideways glance, said to me, "Tasted of the forest's fruits, did you?" I let him live. For now. Just smiled instead. "Off you go, then," he said. and we strode through the arched gate and into the main compound of the Smith & Company brewery. There we quickly ducked into a covered section with a series of doors leading into warehouses and office space. Straight away I set to picking the lock of the first door we came to, as Connor kept watch, talking at the same time. "It must be strange to you, discovering my existence as you have," he said. "I'm actually curious to know what your mother said about me," I replied, working the lockpick. I often wondered what life might have been like, but she and I stayed together. Acting on an instinct, I asked him, "How is she, by the way?" "Dead," he said. "She was murdered." By Washington, I thought, but said nothing except, "I'm sorry to hear that." "Really? It was done by your men." By now I'd opened the door, but instead of going through, I closed it and turned to face Connor. "What?" "I was just a child when they came looking for the elders. I knew they were dangerous even then, so I stayed silent. Charles Lee beat me unconscious for it." So I had been right. Charles had indeed left the physical as well as the metaphorical imprint of his Templar ring on Connor. It was not hard to let the horror show on my face, although I pretended to be shocked as he continued. "When I woke, I found my village in flames. Your men were gone by then, as well as any hope for my mother's survival. Now was an opportunity to try to convince him of the truth." "Impossible," I said. "I gave no such order. Spoke of the opposite, in fact. I told them to give up the search for the precursor site. We were to focus on more practical pursuits." Connor looked dubious, but shrugged. "It doesn't matter. It's long done now." Oh, but it did. It did matter. "But you've grown up all your life believing me, your own father, responsible for this atrocity. I had no hand in it." "Maybe you speak true. Maybe not. How am I ever to know?" 3. Silently we let ourselves into the warehouse, where stacked barrels seemed to crowd out any light, and not far away stood a figure with his back to us. The only sound the soft scratching he made as he wrote in a ledger he held. I recognized him at once, of course, and drew a long breath before calling out to him. "Benjamin Church," I announced. "You stand accused of betraying the Templar Order and abandoning our principles in pursuit of personal gain. In consideration of your crimes, I hereby sentence you to death." Benjamin turned. Only it wasn't Benjamin. It was a decoy, who suddenly cried, "Now! Now!" at which the room was full of men who rushed from hiding places, holding pistols and swords on us. "You're too late," crowed the decoy. "Church and the cargo are long gone, and I'm afraid you won't be in any condition to follow." We stood, the men assembled before us, and thanked God for Achilles and his training, because we were both thinking the same things. We were thinking, when facing superior strength, wrest from them the element of surprise. We were thinking, turn defense into attack. So that's what we did. We attacked. With a quick glance at one another, we both released our blades, both sprung forward, both embedded them into the nearest guard, whose screams echoed around the brick walls of the warehouse. I kicked out and sent one of their gunmen skidding back and smashing his head against a crate, then was upon him, my knees on his chest, driving the blade through his face and into his brain. I twisted in time to see Connor whirl, keeping low and slicing his blade hand around at the same time, opening the stomachs of two luckless guards who both dropped, clutching at their gaping stomachs, both dead men who didn't know it yet. A musket went off, and I heard the air sing, knowing the ball had just missed me, but making the sniper pay for it with his life. 2 men came towards me, swinging wildly, and as I took them both down, I thanked our lucky stars that Benjamin had used mercenaries rather than Templar men, who wouldn't have been so swiftly overcome. As it was, the fight was short and brutal, until just the decoy was left, and Connor was looming over him as he trembled like a frightened child on the brickwork floor, now slick with blood. I finished a dying man, then strode over to hear Connor demand, "Where's Church?" "I'll tell you," wailed the decoy. "Anything you want. Only promise that you'll let me live." Connor looked at me, and whether or not we agreed, he helped him to his feet. With a nervous glance from one to the other of us, the decoy continued. "He left yesterday for Martinique. Took passage on a trading sloop called the Welcome. Loaded half its hold with the supplies he stole from the Patriots. That's all I know. I swear." Standing behind him, I thrust my blade into his spinal cord, and he stared in blank amazement at the blood-stained tip as it protruded from his chest. "You promised," he said. "And he kept his word," I said coldly, and looked at Connor, almost daring him to contradict me. "Let's go," I added, just as a trio of riflemen rushed onto the balcony above us with a clatter of boots on wood, tucked their rifle musket butts into their shoulders, and opened fire. But not at us. At barrels nearby, which, too late, I realized were full of gunpowder. I just had time to heave Connor behind some beer barrels as the first of the kegs went up, followed by the ones around it, each exploding with a deafening thunderclap that seemed to bend the air and stop time. A blast so fierce that when I opened my eyes and took my hands away from my ears, I found I was almost surprised the warehouse was still standing around us. Every man in the place had either hurled himself to the ground or been thrown there by the force of the explosion. But the guards were picking themselves up, reaching for their muskets, and still deafened, shouting at each other as they squinted through the dust for us. Flames were licking up the barrels, crates catching fire. Not far away, a guard came running onto the warehouse floor, his clothes and hair ablaze, screamed as his face melted, then sank to his knees and died face down to the stone. The greedy fire found some nearby crates stuffing, which went up in an instant. All around us, an inferno. Musket balls began zipping around us. We felled 2 swordsmen on our way to the steps leading up to the gantry, then hacked our way through a squad of 4 riflemen. The fire was rising quickly. Even the guards were beginning to escape now. So we ran to the next level, climbing up and up until at last we'd reached the attic of the brewery warehouse. Our assailants were behind us, but not the flames. Looking out of a window, we could see water below us, and I cast around for an exit. Connor grabbed me and swung me towards the window, smashing the 2 of us through the glass so that we dropped to the water before I'd even had a chance to protest. 7th of March, 1778. 1. There was no way I was going to let Benjamin get away. Not having had to put up with life on the Aquila for almost a month, trapped with Connor's friend and ship's captain Robert Faulkner, among others, chasing Benjamin's schooner, which had stayed just out of our reach, dodging cannon attacks, catching tantalizing glimpses of him on the deck of his ship, his taunting face. No way was I going to let him get away. Especially as we came so near in waters close to the Gulf of Mexico, the Aquila at last racing up alongside his schooner. Which was why I snatched the ship's wheel from Connor, wrenched it hard starboard, and with a lurch sent the ship speeding towards the schooner. Nobody had expected that to happen. Not the crew of his ship. Not the men on the Aquila. Not Connor or Robert. Only me. And I'm not sure I knew until I did it. when any crew member who wasn't hanging on to something was thrown violently to the side, and the prow of the Aquila crunched into the schooner's port side at an angle, breaching and splintering the hull. Perhaps it was rash of me. Perhaps I would owe Connor, and certainly Faulkner, an apology for the damage done to their ship. But I couldn't let him get away. 2. For a moment there was a stunned silence, just the sound of ship debris slapping against the ocean around, and the groan and creak of battered, distressed timber. The sails fluttered in a gentle breeze above us, but neither ship moved, as though both were immobilized by the shock of the impact. And then, just as suddenly, a cry went up as the crew from both ships recovered their senses. I was ahead of Connor, and had already dashed to the prow of the Aquila, swinging to the deck of Benjamin's schooner, where I hit the wood with extended blade, and killed the first crew member who raised a weapon towards me, stabbing him and swinging his writhing body overboard. Spotting the hatch, I ran to it, hauled out a sailor trying to escape, and punched the blade into his chest, before taking the steps and, with a final look at the devastation I'd caused, as the two huge ships locked together and began slowly to turn in the ocean, I slammed the hatch closed behind me. From above came the thunder of feet on deck, the muted screams and gun blasts of battle, and the thud of bodies hitting the wood. Below decks there was a strange, damp, almost eerie silence. But from further along, I realized, came the slosh and drip that told me the schooner was taking on water. I grabbed a wooden strut as it suddenly listed, and somewhere the drip of water became a constant flow. How long would it remain afloat, I wondered. Meantime, I saw what Connor would soon discover, that the supplies we'd spent so long in pursuit of were non-existent, or on this ship anyway. Just as I was absorbing this, I heard a noise and twisted to see Benjamin Church holding a pistol two-handed on me, squinting along its sights. "Hello, Hightam," he snarled and pulled the trigger. He was good. I knew that. It was why he pulled the trigger right away, to put me down while he still had the element of surprise. And why he didn't aim directly for me, but at a spot slightly to my right, because I'm a right-sided fighter, and would naturally dive to my strongest side. But of course I knew that because I'd trained him. And his shot smacked harmlessly into the hull when I dived, not to the right, but to the left, rolled, then came to my feet, pounced, and was upon him before he could draw his sword. With a fistful of his shirt in my hand, I snatched his pistol and tossed it away. "We had a dream, Benjamin," I snarled into his face. "A dream you sought to destroy. And for that, my fallen friend, you will be made to pay." I kneed him in the groin. When he doubled over, gasping with pain, I drove my fist into his abdomen, then followed it up with a punch to the jaw that was hard enough to send two bloodied teeth skittering along the deck. I let him drop, and he fell to where the wood was already wet, his face splashing into a wash of incoming seawater. Again the ship lurched, but for the moment, I didn't care. When Benjamin tried to get to his hands and knees, I lashed out with my boot, kicking whatever breath he had left out of him. Next I grabbed a length of rope and hauled him to his feet, shoved him against a barrel, then wound it around him, securing him fast. His head dropped forward, trails of blood, spit, and snot spooling slowly to the wood below. I stood back, took hold of his hair, then looked into his eyes, drove a fist into his face, and heard the crunch of his breaking nose, then stood back, shaking the blood from my knuckles. "Enough!" cried Connor from behind me, and I turned to see him staring at me, and then at Benjamin, with a disgusted look on his face. "We came here for a reason," he said. I shook my head. "Different reasons, it seems." But Connor pushed past me and waded through water now ankle-deep to Benjamin, who regarded him with defiance in his bruised and bloodshot eyes. "Where are the supplies you stole?" Connor demanded. Benjamin spat. "Go to hell," and then, incredibly, began to sing Rule Britannia. I stepped forward. "Shut your mouth, Church." Not that it stopped him. He continued singing. "Connor," I said, "get what you need from him and let's be done with this." And at last Connor stepped forward, his blade engaged, and held it to Benjamin's throat. "I ask again," said Connor, "where is your cargo?" Benjamin looked at him and blinked. For a moment I thought his next move would be to insult or spit at Connor, but instead he began to speak. "On the island yonder, awaiting pickup. But you've no right to it. It isn't yours." "No, not mine," said Connor. "Those supplies are made for men and women who believe in something bigger than themselves, who fight and die that one day they may live free from tyranny such as yours." Benjamin smiled sadly. "Are these the same men and women who fight with muskets forged from British steel, who bind their wounds with bandages sewn by British hands? How convenient for them that we do the work. They reap the rewards. You spin a story to excuse your crimes, as though you're the innocent one and they the thieves," argued Connor. "It's all a matter of perspective. There is no single path through life that is right and fair, and does no harm. Do you truly think the Crown has no cause, no right to feel betrayed? You should know better than this, dedicated as you are to fighting Templars, who themselves see their work as just. Think on that the next time you insist that your work alone befits the greater good. Your enemy would beg to differ, and would not be without cause." "Your words may have been sincere," whispered Connor, "but it does not make them true." And he finished him. "You did well," I said, as Benjamin's chin dropped to his chest, and his blood splashed to the water that continued to rise. "His passing is a boon for us both. Come on. I suppose you'll want my help retrieving everything from the island." 16th of June, 1778. 1. It had been months since I'd last seen him, but I cannot deny I thought of him often. When I did, I thought, what hope is there for us? Me, a Templar forged in the crucible of treachery, but a Templar nevertheless, and him an assassin, created by the butchery of the Templars. Once upon a time, many years ago, I dreamed of one day uniting assassin and Templar, but I was a younger and more idealistic man then. The world had yet to show me its true face, and its true face was unforgiving, cruel, and pitiless, barbaric and brutal. There was no place in it for dreams. And yet he came to me again, and though he said nothing, not so far anyway, I wondered if the idealism I'd once had lurked behind those eyes. And it was that which brought him once more to my door in New York, seeking answers, perhaps, or wanting an end to some doubt that nagged at him. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps there was an uncertainty that resided within that young soul, after all. New York was still in the grip of the redcoats, squads of them out on the streets. It was years later, and still nobody had been held responsible for the fire that had plunged the city into a grimy, soot-stained depression. Parts of it were still uninhabitable. Martial law continued. The redcoats' rule was harsh, and the people more resentful than ever. As an outsider, I studied the two groups of people, the downtrodden city folk giving hateful looks to the brutalized, unruly soldiers. I watched them with a jaundiced eye, and dutifully I continued. I worked to try to help win this war, end the occupation, find peace. I was grilling one of my informants, a wretch named Twitch, because of something he did with his nose, when I saw Connor out of the corner of my eye. I held up a hand to stop him while I continued listening to Twitch, and wondered what he wanted. What business did he have with the man he believed had given the order to kill his mother? "We need to know what the Loyalists are planning if we are to put an end to this," I said to my man. Connor loitered, overhearing. Not that it mattered much. "I've tried," responded Twitch, as his nostrils flared and his eyes darted to Connor. "But the soldiers themselves are told nothing now, only to await orders from above." "Then keep digging. Come and find me when you have something worth sharing." Twitch nodded, slunk off, and I took a deep breath to face Connor. For a moment or so we regarded one another, and I looked him up and down, his assassin's robes somehow at odds with a young Indian boy beneath, his long dark hair, those piercing eyes, Zio's eyes. What lay behind them, I wondered. Above us, a flock of birds made itself comfortable on the ledge of a building, cawing loudly. Nearby, a patrol of redcoats lounged by a cart to admire passing laundrywomen, making lewd suggestions and responding to any disapproving looks and tuts with threatening gestures. "We're so close to victory," I told Connor, taking his arm and leading him further down the street, away from the redcoats. "Just a few more well-placed attacks and we can end the civil war and be rid of the crown." An almost smile at the edges of his mouth betrayed a certain satisfaction. "What did you intend?" "Nothing at the moment, since we're completely in the dark." "I thought Templars had eyes and ears everywhere," he said, with just a hint of dry humour. Just like his mother. "We did until you started cutting them off." He smiled. "Your contact said it was orders from above. It tells us exactly what we need to do. Track down other Loyalist commanders." "The soldiers answer to the Jaegers," I said. "The Jaegers to the commanders, which means we work our way up the chain." I looked up. Not far away, the redcoats were still being lewd, letting down their uniform, the flag, and King George. The Jaegers were the link between the army high-ups and the troops on the ground and were supposed to keep the redcoats in check, stop them aggravating an already hostile populace. But they rarely showed their faces, only if there was real trouble on the streets, like if someone, say, killed a redcoat. Or two. From my robes I drew my pistol and pointed it across the street. I saw Connor's mouth drop open out of the corner of my eye as I took aim at the unruly group of redcoats near the cart, picked one who even now was making an off-colour suggestion to a woman who walked past with swishing skirts and her head bowed, blushing beneath her bonnet, and pulled the trigger. The report of my gun cracked open the day, and the redcoat staggered back, a penny-sized hole between his eyes already beginning to leak dark red blood as his musket dropped and he fell heavily back into a cart and lay still. For a moment the other redcoats were too shocked to do anything, their heads swinging this way and that as they tried to locate the source of the gunshot while pulling their rifles from their shoulders. I began to make my way across the street. "What are you doing?" called Connor after me. "Kill enough and the Jaegers will appear," I told him. "They'll lead us right back to those in charge." And as one of the redcoats turned to me and went to jab with his bayonet, I swept the blade across his front, slicing through his white criss-crossed belts, his tunic, and his stomach. I laid into the next one straight away, while another, who tried to retreat and find space to raise his weapon and fire, backed straight into Connor, and in the next instant was sliding off his blade. The battle was over, and the street, busy before, was suddenly empty. At the same time I heard bells, and winked. The Jaegers are out, just as I said they'd be. It was a matter of trapping one, a task I was happy to leave to Connor, and he didn't let me down. In less than an hour we had a letter, and as groups of Jaegers and redcoats ran shouting up and down the streets, angrily searching for the two assassins. "Assassins, I tell you! They used the blade of the Hashashin!" who had so mercilessly cut down one of their patrols. We took to the roofs, where we sat and read it. "The letter's encrypted," said Connor. "Not to worry," I said. "I know the cipher. After all, it's a Templar invention." I read it, then explained. "The British command is in disarray. The Howe brothers have resigned, and Cornwallis and Clinton have left the city. The leadership that remains has called a meeting at the ruins of Trinity Church. It's there we should go." 2. The Trinity Church was at the intersection of Wall Street and Broadway. Or, I should say, what was left of the Trinity Church was at the intersection of Wall Street and Broadway. It had been badly burned in the Great Fire of September 76, so badly burned, in fact, that the British hadn't bothered to try to convert it to use as barracks or to imprison patriots. Instead, they'd constructed a fence and used it for occasions such as this, the meeting of commanders that Connor and I fully intended to gatecrash. Wall Street and Broadway were both dark. The lamplighters didn't come here because there were no lamps to light, none in working order anyway. Like everything else within about a mile's radius of the church, they were blackened and soot-covered, their windows smashed. And what would they illuminate anyway? The greyed-out, broken windows of the surrounding buildings? Empty stone and wooden carcasses, fit only for habitation by stray dogs and vermin. Above it all towered the spire of Trinity, and it was there we headed, scaling one of the remaining walls of the church in order to take up position. As we climbed, I realized that what the building reminded me of was an enlarged version of my home at Queen Anne's Square, how it had looked after the fire. And as we crouched in the shadowy alcoves awaiting the arrival of the redcoats, I recalled the day I'd gone back to the house with Reginald, and how it had looked. Like the church, its roof had been taken by fire. Like the church, it was a shell, a shadow of its former self. Above us, the stars twinkled in the sky, and I stared at them for a moment through the open roof, until an elbow in my side roused me from my reverie, and Connor was indicating down to where officers and redcoats were making their way along the deserted rubble of Wall Street towards the church. As they approached, 2 men ahead of the squad were pulling a cart and hanging lanterns in the black and brittle branches of the trees, lighting the way. They reached the church, and we cast our eyes downwards as they hung more lanterns below. They moved quickly among the truncated columns of the church, where weeds, moss, and grass had begun to grow, nature claiming the ruins for herself, and placed lanterns on the font and lectern, then stood to one side as the delegates strode in, 3 commanders and a squad of soldiers. Next, we were both straining to hear the conversation and having no luck. Instead, I counted the guards, 12 of them, but I didn't think it too many. "They're talking in circles," I hissed to Connor. "We'll learn nothing watching as we are." "What do you propose?" he replied. "Do we get down there and demand answers?" I looked at him, grinned. "Well, yes," I said. And in the next instant I was climbing down until I was close enough, and jumped down, surprising 2 of the guards at the rear, who died, their mouths making an O shape. "Ambush!" went the cry as I piled into two more of the redcoats. From above I heard Connor curse as he leapt from his perch to join me. I was right. There weren't too many. The redcoats, as ever, were too reliant on muskets and bayonets, effective on the battlefield perhaps, but useless at close-quarter combat, which was where Connor and I excelled. We were fighting well together by now, almost a partnership. Before long, the moss-covered figurines of the burnt-out church sparkled with fresh redcoat blood. The 12 guards were dead, and just the 3 terrified commanders remained, cowering, lips moving in prayer as they prepared to die. I had something else in mind, a trip to Fort George, to be precise. 3. In southernmost Manhattan was Fort George. Over 150 years old. From the sea it presented a vast skyline of spires, watchtowers, and long barracks buildings that seemed to run across the entire length of the promontory, while inside the towering battlements were expanses of drill square surrounding the tall dormitories and administrative buildings, all of it heavily defended and fortified. A perfect place for the Templars to make their base. A perfect place for us to take the 3 loyalist commanders. "What are the British planning?" I asked the first one, after lashing him to a chair in an interrogation room deep in the bowels of the North End building, where the smell of damp was all-pervasive, and where, if you listened carefully, you could just hear the scratching and gnawing of the rats. "Why should I tell you?" he sneered. "Because I'll kill you if you don't." His arms were bound, but he indicated the interrogation room with his chin. "You'll kill me if I do." I smiled. Many years ago I met a man named Cutter, an expert in torture and the administration of pain, who was able to keep his victims alive for days on end, but in considerable pain, with only— I flicked the mechanism of the blade, and it appeared, glinting cruelly in the flickering torchlight. He looked at it. "You promise me a quick death if I tell you?" "You have my word." So he did, and I kept my word. When it was over, I strode out into the passageway outside, where I ignored Connor's inquisitive look and collected the second prisoner. Back in the cell, I tied him to the chair and watched as his eyes went to the body of the first man. "Your friend refused to tell me what I wanted to know," I explained, "which is why I slit his throat. Are you prepared to tell me what I want to know?" Wide-eyed, he gulped. "Look, whatever it is, I can't tell you. I don't even know. Maybe the commander?" "Oh, you're not the man in charge," I said breezily, and flicked my blade. "Wait a minute," he blurted, as I moved to the back of him. "There is one thing I know." I stopped. "Go on." He told me, and when it was over, I thanked him and drew the blade across his throat. As he died, I realized that what I felt was not the righteous fire of one who performs repellent acts in the name of a greater good, but a sense of jaded inevitability. Many years ago, my father had taught me about mercy, about clemency. Now I slaughtered prisoners like livestock. This was how corrupt I had become. "What's going on in there?" asked Connor suspiciously, when I returned to the passageway where he guarded the final prisoner. "This one is the commander. Bring him in." Moments later, the door to the interrogation room thumped shut behind us, and for a moment the only sound in the room was that of dripping blood. Seeing the bodies discarded in a corner of the cell, the commander struggled, but with a hand to his shoulder I shoved him to the chair, now slick with blood, lashed him to it, then stood before him and flicked my finger to engage my hidden blade. It made a soft, snicking sound in the cell. The officer's eyes went to it, and then to me. He was trying to put on a brave face, but there was no disguising the tremble of his lower lip. "What are the British planning?" I asked him. Connor's eyes were on me. The prisoner's eyes were on me. When he stayed silent, I raised the blade slightly so that it reflected the flickering torchlight. Again, his eyes were fixed on it, and then he broke. To march from Philadelphia. That city is finished. New York is the key. They'll double our numbers, push back the rebels." "When do they begin?" I asked. 2 days from now." "June the 18th, said Connor from beside me. "I need to warn Washington." "See?" I told the commander. "That wasn't very difficult now, was it?" "I told you everything. Now let me go," he said. But I was again in no mood for clemency. I stood behind him, and as Connor watched, opened his throat. At the boy's horrified look, I said, and the other two said the same, "It must be true." When Connor looked at me, it was with disgust. "You killed him. Killed all of them. Why?" "They would have warned the Loyalists," I answered simply. "You could have held them until the fight was done." "Not far away from here is Wallabout Bay," I said, "where the prison ship HMS Jersey is moored, a rotting ship on which Patriot prisoners of war are dying by the thousands, buried in shallow graves on the shores, or simply tossed overboard. That was how the British treat their prisoners, Connor." He acknowledged the point, but countered, "Which is why we must be free of their tyranny." "Ah, tyranny. Don't forget that your leader, George Washington, could save these men on the prison ships if he was so minded. But he does not want to exchange captured British soldiers for captured American ones, and so the American prisoners of war are sentenced to rot on the prison ships of Wallabout Bay. That's your hero, George Washington, at work. However this revolution ends, Connor, you can guarantee that it's the men with riches and land who will benefit. The slaves, the poor, the enlisted men, they will still be left to rot." "George is different," he said. But yes, now there was a note of doubt in his voice. "You will see his true face soon, Connor. It will reveal itself. And when it does, you can make your decision. You can judge him."